As the clock struck midnight, and October the 3rd became October the 4th, the invasion began immediately with the tandem satellite strikes, the anti-sat weapons hitting American satellites, as well as the tandem cyber attack, which made America deaf, mute, and blind, as America's ISR assets had been completely gouged out insofar as those that related to satellite, with the openings of assaults on their drone-based ISR assets, as virtually all of their installations were in various processes of being struck or overrun at this point in time, with a few exceptions, such as what occurred at Fort Sill, due to the fact that local command, insofar as units of the 77th PLA Group Army, wanted to wait for their air support to arrive and for container-based cruise missile strikes to begin shortly after they began their attack. No such luxury could be afforded when it came to the assault on Fort Hood. Fort Hood needed to be eliminated so that Group Armies 7 through 13 of the external invasion prong of those group armies could pass by the area without having to stop to engage the troops on Fort Hood. Hence, the 68th PLA Group Army and 2nd Russian Combined Arms Armies came into play in this regard. As it pertained to the 2nd Combined Arms Army, an active-duty Russian Combined Arms Army that was left responsible with some Latin American allies for capturing San Antonio, in addition to assisting with a PAP paramilitary brigade in capturing Austin. There was a very potent portion of this particular Combined Arms Army that, in conjunction with the 68th PLA Group Army, which was tasked with taking Waco, also very strategic, as Waco was home to defense contractors, one being L3, for example, and also cutting off any potential ability for Americans to try to get onto I-35 should they try to flee the installation directly to the east from Fort Hood. As the PLA 68th Group Army, though, was primarily focused on smashing Fort Hood with the elements of the 2nd Russian Combined Arms Army that had been committed to assisting them in that particular battle. There were ample forces of Trojans all up and down the I-35 corridor, as this was perhaps the single most important invasion route for the external components to make it deep inland as fast as possible and get deep inside the country where they could begin to fan out and assist other Trojans that were much further inland, such as beginning to fan out in northern Oklahoma and beyond, even in Kansas, where they were to link up with externals coming down from Canada. In addition to this, these forces need to overrun and defeat Fort Hood as quickly as possible. There were reasons behind this. One main reason being Fort Hood's simple, close proximity to I-35, such a vital invasion corridor. Another reason being that Fort Hood, out of all of the military installations being overcome in just this south central invasion sector alone, was home to the most troops by far for any single installation, having nearly 40,000 troops based there, as well as, of course, if you add their dependents of many of these troops, and also the civilian employees, that number goes up to nearly 80,000, approximately 75,000 or so, thereabouts. That was a massive installation. At its longest north to south point was well in excess of 30 miles if tacking on West Fort Hood, but from east to west being approximately 30 miles. It was a very large installation in terms of overall land size. Not just its main post, but its aggregate of training ranges, as well as even a portion called North Fort Hood and, of course, West Fort Hood. This installation needed to be captured as fast as possible, and there was little time to spare in so doing. Although the 2nd Combined Arms Army had an ample number of very capable and strong units, 2 of some of its heaviest were deployed for this particular battle in the Lampasas area on CCP regime purchased properties, which were purposed as close strategically to this installation as possible for the future invasion, which was now underway. The 68th PLA Group Army and the 2nd Combined Arms Army would strike exactly at midnight, and again didn't have the luxury to wait until air power arrived, as had been done at the Fort Sill battle. This battle beginning immediately at midnight. On the map, the PLA forces were arranged in a C pattern, going from just slightly to the southwest of West Fort Hood here, this is West Fort Hood, to all the way up I-35, curling around Waco, which was a separate battle that was occurring simultaneously, along with the Battle of Austin and the Battle of San Antonio and the Battle of DFW, all up and down I-35, even in Oklahoma, the Battle of Oklahoma City. All of these battles were all raging up and down I-35, including the battle being fought by the external components coming across the border at Laredo. As this battle opens up, the PLA forces involved in this battle, as the 68th PLA Group Army was going through its second phase of reorganization, as it was a reserve PLA Group Army, but another one of those that was exceedingly well equipped and was just starting to be reorganized on the same grounds as the active duty PLA Group Armies, like the 77th with its different types of combined arms brigades. They had just organized their first combined arms brigade in the form of the 112th Combined Arms Brigade, a medium combined arms brigade with 2 armored battalions, a combat engineer battalion, an artillery battalion, and 2 mechanized infantry battalions, and even an air defense, and of course its headquarters battalion. There was also the Falcon Special Operations Battalion, which was a independent battalion, as the Group Army's Special Operations Forces embedded within it. It also had a electronic warfare SIGINT and ELINT regiment, which was responsible for conducting not just signals intercepts and electronics intercepts, but also had electronic warfare assets as well in the form of its 1EW electronic warfare battalion, whose purpose was to utilize its newest electromagnetic jamming technology to pinpoint the origins of enemy radio signals and jam them with electromagnetic jamming frequencies, in addition to portable radars that were not necessarily dependent upon satellite or even the grid for power, such as the Patriot system radar or SHORAD IM systems radar, and so on, that could be generator powered and not dependent per se on satellites for their use. These forces were absolutely a necessity in this battle, as there were ample air defense forces on the Fort Hood installation. But at the time of the invasion, only almost a quarter of the troops on Fort Hood were actually conducting some kind of live fire training, with much of the rest in their barracks, as in not having their weapons or equipment signed out or ready. The force posture at this base was a bit more lax compared to that at the border with Fort Bliss, for instance, or even that at Fort Sill. While yes, they were trying to conduct real-life types of training maneuvers simulated with real ammunition and real weapons, such as the Patriot batteries and SHORAD elements that were training together in a mixed unit battalion-sized element from the 69th Air Defense Artillery Brigade, as some of these battalion markers aren't even actual entire battalions, but are mixed elements of different companies or different elements from different battalions training together, trying to conduct interoperability training, for instance. These were smaller scale training exercises and not necessarily full brigade on brigade level like what was going on at Fort Sill at the time, because these were all tenant units and there were no visiting training units at this time, and it was just different units on the installation with their different components at company or sometimes at battalion level, training with one another throughout the installation. The Redcon status at this installation was, again, relatively lax compared to the previous two installations, with those battles being covered earlier in this Hypothetical Invasion documentary series. This would come back to really proverbially haunt the installation minutes after midnight, as, again, roughly a quarter of all of the troops on the installation were actually doing any type of real live fire training. Many were simply going to be wiped out in the enormous airstrikes coming in from H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft, a full squadron of which, all 8 of them in this squadron, would be passing the installation and dropping massive quantities of ordnance on different strategic targets such as motor pools and even whole units in the training areas, as it pertained to priority to assist the ground troops. The J-11 Fighter Squadron contributed to this particular battle, in this battle space, this AO. It was testing out a new weapon of the PLAAF. It was testing out the FH-97 fighter drones, which were paired with each of the J-11 fighters. And while the J-11 fighters were predominantly equipped with air-to-air missiles, with very few KD-88 air-to-ground medium-range TV-guided, TV-seeker missiles, and a few laser-guided air-to-ground munitions, they were predominantly armed with air-to-air munitions. However, the FH-97s, similar to the American Loyal Wingman program, but these were far more along in their advancement, having been built years before this invasion, and were, by this point, being debuted for combat. They were predominantly armed with ground attack munitions. So these fighters were essentially doubled in size by the addition of their FH-97 drone fighters that shadowed each aircraft into combat. These were autonomous and could pick targets on their own, but they were paired with the fighter aircraft involved. As for the 68th PLA Group Army, it did not have any of its own aviation assets, so it was using heli-borne assets from the PLAAF. Unlike the PLA Army's ground forces, the PLAAF used some different helicopters, and although they used a fair share of domestically built helicopters, because they were an Air Force asset, they were also utilizing foreign procured helicopters that had been bought back in the late 90s, such as the Mi-171s, which were essentially an upgraded version of the Mi-17 transport utility helicopter. And of course, they were also using the French Super Puma, which was purchased in small numbers. But they were also acquiring their own domestic helicopters, as Chinese helicopter production had skyrocketed since the late 2010s, and China was now going from building dozens of helicopters in the 90s per year to building hundreds of them per year. And as priority was given to for rotary aircraft was given to their ground forces as it pertained to the helicopters, the domestically built helicopters were beginning to proliferate through the Air Force and Navy as well. The helicopters utilized in this particular campaign of the invasion would be 15 PLAAF Mi-171s that would be used to conduct two different special operations missions, one being an air assault capture of the East Airfield in Fort Hood, and another being an air assault operation to capture a high-value individual, the 3-Corps commander himself, in the headquarters building on Fort Hood, as he was anticipated to be there with all of the different international tensions rising. It was anticipated that he was about to raise the Redcon status of this post to match those of Fort Bliss, or at least of Fort Sill. However, he would never get the opportunity to do such, as the invasion began promptly at midnight as the 3rd became the 4th, and Chinese and Russian artillery coming from the Chinese 203rd Field Artillery Brigade, as well as the 112th Combined Arms Brigade, the Russian 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, and of course the 16th Tank Division of the Russians. The 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade and the 16th Tank Division operating self-propelled 152 millimeter howitzers, whereas the 203rd Field Artillery Brigade, as a field artillery brigade, was operating towed howitzers, as well as 122 millimeter rockets and even 300 millimeter rockets. And the Combined Arms Brigade, the 112th, was operating self-propelled howitzers. And even the 17th Armored Brigade, with its own self-propelled howitzers, added its firepower to the operation. All of this beginning exactly at midnight, beginning with an enormous artillery barrage, with the fixed-wing combat aircraft assets in the form of the PLAAF Heavy Strategic Bomber Aircraft and their fighter aircraft arriving specially earmarked for this specific battle space, arriving between 40 and 45 minutes into the overall invasion itself, which by that point, there were many, many units already moving all over the map as by 140 and 145, the Sino-Russian units were already clearing their own flanks, as in capturing towns and cities along the flanks, before moving in for the kill, including the Russians moving in and through Copper's Cove, as well as hitting the outer training areas on the west, with the Chinese beginning to move in to do the same. And the helicopters would arrive approximately by 1:05 or 1:10 a.m., or just over an hour into it, with the fixed-wing aircraft arriving much sooner, with the helicopters to begin the special operations mission to capture the high-value targets throughout the installation, predominantly the three-corps commander himself, as he was the most important of all, and he was wanted alive, in conjunction with taking the airfield second shortly thereafter, as these special operation companies, due to the fact that there were only 15 aircraft earmarked for this specific operation, and they would be utilized by PLAAF helicopter pilots, the PLA ground forces had to work closely with them to carry out these operations. And upon having carried out these operations, the PLAAF helo assets would be utilized for emergency medivacs, whereas the typical ground-based vehicles utilized in that role, such as armored ambulances, would be utilized for less severe WIAs. The battle initiating was enormous in scope and scale, with nearly 40,000 troops facing well in excess of 50,000 on the opposite side, between the Russian and the Chinese PLA units. Armed American civilians, reactionary types, would be fought as Temple was being cleared of any and all armed resistance, as it was vital to control these places like Belton and Temple, as they were directly along I-35. Again, the premier key invasion route straight up the middle of the country. Controlling it was, again, paramount in terms of importance. The artillery raining down would smash built-up areas of the main installation, in conjunction with directly firing upon all the various training forces that were out in the field. Again, these forces being only a quarter, roughly, of the total strength of the installation at the outer training ranges. Many of these battalions were, in fact, mixed elements and not whole single battalions, although there were some, for instance, such as the 1st of the 3rd, or the 1st Squadron of 3rd ACR, which itself had become a striker unit, as the 2nd SCR and 3rd ACR had been reorganized from their original role as a heavy armored reconnaissance styled regiment of 3 Corps to that of a striker regiment, as well as some of the forces of 1st Cav being their whole battalions, such as the 4th of the 9th Battalion right here, while others were mixed. Certain battalions were a mixture of different companies operating together to train in interoperability operations, to train how to work together and conduct certain types of combat operations. Much of this training wasn't larger scale training, but smaller battalion and brigade level trainings. I mean smaller battalion and company level trainings where different companies work together in their training missions and operations and practiced integrating their different relatable skills with one another to complement each other in the operational sense. For example, there was a SHORAD asset and a Patriot asset working together in this mixed battalion marker of air defense forces. This being an air defense battalion marker, although it was made up of mixed forces from the 1st of the 44th, which was a Patriot battalion, and also the 5th of the 4th, which was a SHORAD element of the 69th Air Defense Artillery Brigade. These are just the brigade markers showing which units are here, and some of these subordinate units of some of these units are out in the training ranges. There were various brigades on the installation, and of course there was also a division in the form of 1st Cav. And 3 Corps being the parent unit of all of these brigades and division, and even 3rd ACR, which was now a Striker unit. As the initial phases of the fighting were moving into the phase where contact was being made, the main gates of the installation were simply plowed through, as were the flimsy outer fences that separated the city of Killeen from the main installation, as well as the outer perimeter fencing that separated the training ranges and even West Fort Hood from Copper's Cove and the forces coming from the Lampasas area, from CCP regime properties between Lampasas and Copper's Cove, as well as the Chinese forces coming from their ranches that were strategically purchased, large tracts of land within the regions adjacent to I-35 for easy access. Many as close as possible to the installation. Scenes like this would be common throughout the battle. CCP properties used for supplying the different units, as these were often purchased strategically adjacent to many of the key invasion routes for use by externals and by local Trojan forces, operated by local Trojan forces. T-80 tank, Russian T-80, rolling through the main post. The artillery impacts, buildings on fire, loitering munition. Russia and China would both be using loitering munitions in huge quantities at this battle. The Russians, their Lancet 3s, and the Chinese, their CH-901As. And of course, both sides, as in within the coalition, the Chinese and Russian sides, respectively, within the coalition, operating reconnaissance drones at the squad levels and platoon levels, all the way up to higher flying, high altitude drones, and of course, military satellites. And scenes such as what had occurred at Fort Sill would be occurring here as well. All in all, the battle for Fort Hood would last 4 hours as far as it related to the heaviest combat, with residual fighting, as this was a massive area, over double the size what Fort Sill is in terms of square miles. The residual fighting would last 12 full hours from midnight to 12 in the afternoon. And there would even be certain American forces that would early on escape the installation before the ring was totally shut, and would indeed race north, with some racing to the northeast towards Interstate 35, only to be destroyed in the process, with others going directly north beyond Gatesville and into the Waco area, only to be discovered, fought, and destroyed during that battle that was occurring simultaneously there. These forces again would escape before they could be completely encircled between the Chinese forces and the Russian forces, with Russian forces pursuing them later in the fighting, with the rest of the area being swept between the hours of 4 a.m. to 12 p.m., or the 12th hour of battle, from midnight till 12 a.m., or till 12 p.m. in the afternoon, the next day, the same day, but the next day in terms of darkness changing to daylight. On the first day, this battle would perhaps be the longest insofar as it related to the military installations as a whole, but the objectives of it would have been achieved by 4 a.m. or 4 hours into it, with much of the major fighting wrapping up by then, only to see small scattered groupings of infantry-type forces hiding throughout the installation, only to be discovered as the Chinese and Russian ground troops went through, mopping up the remainder of them through cordon and sweep, or cordon and search operations, where they would literally go, after the major combat, go grid square by grid square, getting every last one of them and capturing them or annihilating them. Essentially, the battle was a 4-hour one, but technically it was a full 12, if going by the cordon and sweeping. However, these forces that escaped very early on would be throwing their weight into a different battle occurring in the Waco battle. But that is a different battle ahead in the series. The next video after this intro video of the Battle of Fort Hood, we'll cover the fighting at the main gate and the headquarters building, as both were essentially, for all intents and purposes, relatively within the same area overall, as it was a short distance between the main gate and the headquarters building. With many, many more sub-battle maps of this much larger battle map to show, as this indeed is a large battle, and perhaps one of, if not the most important battles in the series, as this was the largest American installation in the South Central Invasion sector, and it was very near to I-35. Again, those being the two primary reasons why it needed to be completely and totally pulverized as rapidly as possible, so that the external invasion forces could travel unimpeded up Interstate 35 without having to stop to engage. And the PLA 68th Group Army and a division and brigade of the 2nd Combined Arms Army were chosen to carry out the task, with heavy air support from the PLAAF in this particular AO.